Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you guys are. I hope you have a fantastic day. It's SoulSaint here. I've been wanting to do this video for a minute now, but the problem is that like I wanted to make sure that I gave myself enough time to kind of get experience in various different areas in the game and kind of get like a baseline reference point for myself, as well as confer with other people who have had those experiences in the game, whether that's from early progression to in-game progression, the whole 9 yards, like everything in between. The purpose of this video is just to drive a conversation about how the goalpost in terms of where you're at in the game has changed significantly. A lot of times being able to do stage 25 and like the normal dungeons used to be what would be considered, you know, top end game, and being able to speed farm those is like true end game and whatnot. And that's now not the case. You know, I would even argue that that's not even close towards end game anymore. And to also give people like a reference point of areas to look at, like where am I at in the game? And a lot of times people ask me a lot of questions, which is like some of the biggest ones is like, you know, what should I be working on, or who should I work on next? And like, I don't know what to do, like give me some focus. And I always ask them, you know, whenever they ask questions about how they should build a champion up, or who they, you know, who should they build up in general, my first one is you know, what is your focus? And a lot of that comes from a place where you know, there's so much going on in the game that you kind of have to designate specific things and like work on specific projects. And believe it or not, if you watch me while I've been live on Twitch, a lot of times I always refer to, I think I might have it up as a matter of fact, what I consider like a raid project map. So it's basically like ideas and things that I work on for my account to help my account flourish and become ever more successful. So write down ideas, writing down you know, team compositions that would help me do what I need to do for this particular dungeon or for this particular boss or whatever the case may be. That's how I kind of give myself some focus. So I would definitely argue that you guys should consider doing something similar to that in some capacity, so that you have like a goal plan going forward, right? But in between that, it's good to kind of like identify where you're at in the game. So, you know, this conversation is, am I early game? Am I late game? Am I mid game? Am I, you know, somewhere in between, you know? And we're going to kind of list it out. This is going to be my approach to it. I did confer with some people, and I want to give us a loose to short on skills. Me and him both balanced ideas off of each other, and I mainly wanted to give people a reference point. This is the minimum what I want you to do. It's not the law. It's not the end all be all. And God knows this may take, you know, changes down the road as new content comes out, the whole 9 yards, right? And we're gonna go into the game, and we're gonna be referring to this this text document that I made here just as a reference point. But I am gonna delineate between different phases of the game. So early game is basically the beginning, in game is the end, obviously, and then in between you have what's considered like mid game and late game, right? So like that's the way I'm gonna do it. You got early game, you got mid game, you got late game, and then you have end game.
Why would you do that? We're in the end game now.
Okay, and then, you know, we'll try to see if like we're at in between those spots that you're at, because it's kind of hard to delineate when you stepped off of one and entered another phase of the game. So with that being said, let's jump into it. Early game. What is your account progression in Raid Shadow Legends? So when you're playing early game, the first thing you're gonna be looking at is pretty much getting your feet wet. This starts the moment you turn the game on for the first time. So a lot of players are met with the requirements of like picking a choice between characters. Of course, everybody who has been playing for a while or understands the game a little bit more from a fundamental standpoint, they're gonna pick champions like, I think the best two right now would probably be like Kale and then Athel followed up. And there's reasons why. I'm gonna do a breakdown video for like a beginner's guide on how to get started in Raid in the not too distant future, but pretty much I'm going to be a little bit more generalistic in this approach here, okay? So when you first start off early game, one of the first things I try to tell people is that like this game is a quality over quantity game. So like instead of getting a bunch of different champions to 5 stars level 50, it's much more beneficial for you to take one champion and get him to the best of his ability. So quality over quantity. So that conversation is always going to be something I try to push players towards. And in tandem with that, while they're working towards that goal in the back of their head, you know, they're following on through their progression in campaign. So, you know, doing each chapter, each mission for the first time. Same with missions, Missions are another way, like a good reference point to kind of like know where you need to focus at your efforts and progress your account. And there's a lot of reasons why, right? There's a lot of good resources there that'll help you get started in the game, as well as there's some champions that are pretty monumental, and I would even dare say meta to some capacity, where you have value. You know, Arbiter being one of the big more staples for your go first team. She's literally known as the best, one of the best, if not the best, speed league champion for her 30% arena order, right, for PvP. And then you have champions like Ramontu who provide a lot in their kits, and I haven't even got to Ramontu yet, but I understand that champion has a lot going on. Is he like meta at the very, very top end? That could be up for debate. There's a little bit there could be an argument for or against it, depending on how you add variables like polymorph or something, you know, some context. You know, context is 9/10 of the law when it comes to whether or not something's valid or should be disregarded, right? But during that period when you're first starting off in the game, you don't really have much of a champion pool. At best, the only champion that you know right off the rip that you're going to have is your starter champion, which most of them are pretty solid for the most part. You know, there's some caveats behind each one of them, makes them stand out in certain areas more than others, but for the most part, they're pretty on par with each other. I think the only exception I'd make is probably for like base Gallic. Gallic is he's a little bit underwhelming considering how his kit works, and I think like maybe a small change here and there would change the factor of his entire, like what he does for your early game account could be so much more monumentally impactful if they made some changes to him. But you know, it's a starter champion, so at the end of the day, it's just to get the ball rolling, right? The next thing I try to tell people to do is that you're trying to improve your teams and start to developing a core team, right? So like in specific, when you're first starting the game off, one of your champions is going to be your starter, right? You can get like a promo code. I know that right now they have Deacon, and that may not be possible down the line. Maybe they take that code away, it becomes expired, whatever the case may be. But like, you know, that your starter champion in tandem with like maybe a promo code champion or a daily login champion like our recently acquired Artek. He is available upon 7 days of login. A very, very strong champion, right? Gives you a lot of value. You know, those two champions will be like a good starting point, right? They'll get the ball rolling for you. But you're gonna have to put some time into it. You're gonna want to make sure that you know you're developing those champions. So you know, putting the right amount of effort to them is very important. And then furthermore, trying to develop 5 champions in particular, because the first thing you're going to be tackling is clan boss, right? Clan boss is your lifeline to shards, is what I try to tell people. So this game is all about champion pool and resource management and utilizing your account and champions that you have at your disposal to the most effective, most efficient way possible, right? A lot of times for early game players, they're going to be battling through normal to hard. Top chest completion should be more common as your first 5-man team is leveled. So, you know, developing them, this is what I meant by the quality versus quantity, like actually leveling them all the way up to level 60, 6-starred, fully ascended, fully mastered out, and potentially, and this is a caveat depending on the champion you're looking at, booked, before you start entering into like the harder difficulties of clan boss. I think, you know, normal, easy, hard, those are fairly not difficult to do as you develop a champion. I would argue that like by the time you finish up just Kale alone, you're already stepping into normal / hard territory. You know, if you have his masteries and him fully ascended, fully booked, and fully leveled, basically bring him to his full fruition, right? At that point, you know, once you start developing your 5-man team, you're going to be using them everywhere. So areas like dungeons, and in terms of dungeon progression, you will be able to do 1 to 15 as you're progressing along. That will be dependent upon a couple variables, right? But like the main focus is that you'll be able to make progression. I think for the most part, for like the first 6 to 10, it's relatively easy. Granted, you're moving in the right way. So like, for example, your starter champion benefits heavily early game from like using a lifesteal set that you get from daily login. You know, that first 7 days will give you decent pieces that you can use, and you can take the first 4 pieces of your daily login, slap that on your starter champion, and then boom, you already have like a core set. Maybe with the campaign at chapter 11, you get like the cruel pieces. It's like a 4-star piece, hand and shield. Throw that in tandem with the first 4 pieces of lifesteal, you have a full 6-piece set that you're running across the board, right? That would be one way you could do it for your starter champion. If you're using someone like Kale, maybe an argument can be made that, you know, you maybe visit the faction wars a little bit early, get some perception pieces going, something around those lines. Basically, there's no one clear way to do it, but the main focus is that you're building in a way that will make your character efficient, right? And we can go more into like gear progression and how that is going to look. We'll talk about that as we go along. But the main focus is like, you know, if you're developing your champions and you're developing your first core team, that first 5-man, and it should have, you know, some things met, you know, whether it's some tanks that can do some control or some debuffers, damage dealers, healers, you know, someone that can sustain your team up. All those variables will play in mind to hopefully develop you a really strong first 5-man team, right? And you're going to take that team pretty much everywhere, whether that's, you know, dungeons, campaign, clan boss, the whole 9 yards. That's going to be your core at the very beginning, because you're trying to just basically, dabble in a little bit of everything, right? And that's pretty much what I'm saying here. So like, you're gonna just practically try to get all the content you can done with that core 5. Sometimes brute forcing it, where you're just gonna overwhelm it with damage, or maybe a champion or two you have significantly is beneficial in a particular fight. For example, Artek being a daily login, he has an AoE HP burn, which is a meta way of doing spider content at the higher end side. So like, automatically having Artek means that you have a lifeline into the harder content for spider. So like, doing like the upper 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 and higher, using Artek will basically give you a step closer to completion, beating that, maybe even farming it on a regular basis. So the stages 1 through 15 are just a contingency, just letting you know that like roughly you're going to be within that range when you're first starting off, right? Dragon progression is going to be a primary focus when you're looking into dungeons, because it's going to provide sets like speed, accuracy, which are going to be very, very important for your account. And then depending on what you have on your team, if you log in, you picked Kale, you did your promo code for Deacon, and then you got Artek as a part of your daily log, so you already have three of the 5 core, right? Well, Deacon enables like leech, so that would be the case for you not needing lifesteal, for example. But so say for instance you didn't get Deacon, and that time has come and gone, and you're committed to your account now, then maybe farming lifesteal, for example, would be valuable. Dragon enables all that, all those different sets that'll have some form of value as you're progressing in the game will be good. And that's going to be a dungeon that you're always going to be roughly in. You're always going to be looking to push your speed, your minimum speed stats, or your peak speed stats to another level. So farming that gear, and I'll just go ahead and be a disclaimer at this point, gear farming is going to be practically a ever-existing experience throughout your raid playtime. You're always going to be looking to upgrade your gear to the next step, to the next level, right? Spider's also going to be another one too, roughly around like stage 10. I don't know if it's bugged still or not, or if there's any kind of like arguments for that, and you guys can talk to me out. Like this is just a drive conversation, okay? Spider progression for me, I think I saw like when you're first starting out, if you can get roughly at stage 10 and you start farming at 10 for the most part, that opens the door for you to at least get blue star, 5-star gear. When it comes to your accessories, Spider being the lifeline of your accessory pool. That's pretty much where you're going to get most of your stuff at, right? So, like, those two dungeons are going to be pretty much staple when you're first starting out, right? Ice Golem, on the other hand, is very niche, and as an early game account, you're not really looking at that. You're pretty much just looking to build up a solid core team, not one that's very niche and specific. So, Ice Golem is not as prevalent, but it does have some niche sets that are useful, but I would say it's not very beneficial for players at this point of progression. Players at this point of the game may not have enough of a champion pool to progress into Fire Knight dungeons aggressively yet, as there are mechanics needing specific types of champions. So, a mechanic about Fire Knight, for those that are new that are watching this, Fire Knight requires you to have to beat down the shield that he has up initially when you first enter his fight, and then you have to kill him before he gets his turn, or else he re-puts that shield back up and he does a little bit of AoE damage. So there are some mechanics and there's some specific ways to fight Fire Knight, and there's champions that are staple that are really, really good against them, and we could do a demonstration of that sometime in the future if necessary. But that type of content is very specific in the type of champion pool types you're going to need, or type of abilities required. So multi-hitters are very valuable. Now, if you pick someone like Atho as your starter champion, then you may have a lifeline already directly into that. Another caveat is like players that had Rhonda as a part of their daily login champions. Those champions that have multi-hitters are ones that would enable you to maybe touch into Fire Knight a little bit more sooner. But I view Fire Knight as a little bit more of a later progression type of content dungeon, so also not going to be, for the point of this conversation and the point of where we're at in the game, at this point of progression, not as valuable, but will be later down the road, okay? So gear progression, we were talking about this earlier. You'll be roughly trying to get away from like 1-star, 2-star, 3-star gear immediately. When the game starts, that's what it's going to be throwing at you when you're going into campaign. You're like, oh, maybe this is a good piece or not. It's not. It's not. Rarity and star level quality of the gear is very, very important, because the amount of stats you get in tandem with the ability to enhance them are very, very important. So the higher the rarity, the higher the star value, the better your gear is going to be, right? That's a no-brainer. But in particular, because of how quickly you can progress in this game, especially from an early game standpoint, 3-star and below gear is phased out almost like in the snap of a finger, in the blink of an eye. It's very quick. So to be resource efficient, remember this game is a resource management type of game, looking into pieces that are like 3-star or below is not beneficial. So like you're immediately looking to push 4-star gear and utilize those types of pieces. I mean, right now we're in the middle of a Call of the Arbiter event where you're practically going to get 6-star, 5-star pieces for just watching the episode or for the rewards that we've already hit for pretty much everybody. So like all these episodes that are hitting these milestones on YouTube are available for them to grab, and these are potentially really, really good pieces that you can get. As a matter of fact, I'm working on an alt account for someone right now, and I've utilized literally all 6 pieces that you could have acquired from Call of the Arbiter on the Deacon, for example, right? And that's an easy way to jump in, but that's just to show you how quickly you can get 4-star or higher pieces that supersede your 3-star or below pieces, right? So it's going to go away very, very fast. It's going to be very, very quick that you're going to lose those pieces. So you're pretty much aiming for a minimum of like blue star, epic gear, if you can, around 4-star or higher. Now, the reality is that may change as depending on where you're at, depending on what you acquire along the way. But it goes without saying, 3-star and below gear are not worth the resources. And then depending on the champion pool, gear that compensates for team's inefficiency, so non-healer cons may need lifesteal, accessory, accuracy sets to facilitate landing debuffs. All that stuff is going to be valuable. But when you're developing a foundation for gear, the main core about it is not so much the set you're using, it's the stats you're getting. So stats over sets are the priority. I think that a lot of people don't recognize that, like, you're trying to facilitate doing all this within a specific set, when the reality is that you could probably dismantle that set, take what's good from it, the good stats from like, you may have one piece out of that entire set that's really, really good, and then you plug and play with some other broken pieces, so you're not putting a set piece together, but your stats are super well designed to a point where you're effective, and that's more important right now at this point in the game versus trying to force sets whenever it's not necessary. Doom Tower, and I'm trying to hit like a little bit of everywhere like of the game when you're first starting out. Okay, so during this period you're probably already kind of like leveling up. You're probably getting into your 20s, your 30s, your 40s pretty effectively, right? It starts slowing down at this point, but you start noticing that like a lot more content opens up, like Doom Tower, for example. I would expect a new player, people that are progressing or considered early game, to have difficulties progressing through the floors. You may not be able to get too far past like maybe the first couple of bosses in the normal range, so that makes sense. But as you develop a wider range of champions, that'll slowly become a little bit easier, right? No need to force it, but it is something that that people will experience. It's a great place for resources, but at this point in the game you may have a little bit of a difficulty climbing, right? But despite that difficulty, players benefit greatly from the rewards and should always make small attempts to gain progression. But this will not be an immediate focus. So at this point of the game, you're looking to just roughly, wherever you can get your victories, get them, but like keep it going. You know what I mean? Don't sit there and spend days trying to beat this and not do any other thing in the game. I think that would be a ineffective use of your time, right? Arena progression. I think at the beginning of the game, the moment you are exposed to arena is important, right? So you're pushing towards gaining as many medals as possible. And the reason why is that these are just permanent stats that can be contributed to all of your champions from different affinities, right? So as you're progressing, you'll look at to add a speed lane champion that pushes turn meter. And this is for like PvP arena focus when you're first starting out. Followed up by like a decreased defense champion, whether that's your Deacon, who does both of those, for example, or a high Katoon that you get as a daily login, and then War Maiden, which is a champion you can farm in campaign. Followed up with like your damage dealers, right? So that's the main focus of it, right? Champion diversity will become more important as you get to Silver 4 or higher. So like as you're aspiring to go into higher levels of arena progression, you'll notice that the champions that you're going against are going to be a little bit more diverse. And at that point, you also need to be aware that your pool should be growing in that diversity as well, okay? Faction wars, and I would say roughly like if you're pushing into low silver or anywhere between bronze to low silver, that's about expected when you're first progressing in the game, right? It's going to be a little bit before you start developing not only the champion pool but the gear to support being able to push higher content. That's when you start noticing the breakthrough to like maybe even gold or eventually maybe platinum down the road if you're really, really looking forward to PvP. Faction wars is going to be hard, man. I think when you're first starting off at in the game, you'll be able to do like very, very low stages depending on your champion pool, and that's pretty much the biggest thing. If you hear me talking throughout this entire time, it's dependent upon your champion pool, right? And that's why clan boss to me is like #1 focus, because you're looking to add to your champion pool. That diversity is important, right? So clan boss #1, right? Faction wars are an indicator about how diverse you are. If you want to know, I think I got enough champions that are across the board, across different factions, the whole 9 yards. If you think that's the case, take a look at faction wars. Faction wars will either humble you or support what you're saying, And When you first start off in the game and you're trying to do faction wars, more often than not, that core 5-man team or your starter champion will be those factions that those champions are associated to will probably be the champions that you'll make big, or those factions that those champions are a part of. They will make the big strides you're looking for. So, you will have difficulty beating faction war content due to a lack of champions. And then further down the line, just as a personal caveat, because I did get Lydia not too long ago, gear can also play a factor. So compositions, all that stuff, all that diversity that we've been talking about up until this point will be hard for you to do. But nevertheless, it's still something important that where you can get your victories in, get it. Don't sit on it and don't dwell on it for too long. But for the most part, if you have like your KO, for example, as a part of the Dark Elf team, I don't see any reason that a 6-star KO that has at a minimum that 5-star gear as a baseline to be able to do like the first couple stages, which means that by beating those, you're getting resources for your forge, which is a very, very strong place to get gear and optimal gear. It's a great place to get important sets like perception, which are valuable on KO, right? Maybe even resilience or swift parry or deflection. Those are all sets that you can get and farm materials for inside the faction war area, right? So being able to get like the ground, you know, basically you're breaking foundation towards being able to build those, of course, is ideal. So, you know, looking at your core 5-man team that you've been developing over time will be very, very important for you to look at when it comes to faction wars. But overall, at this point, you're not going to have a lot of champions, right? So beating that may be a little bit impossible. Let's just be real for a second. Now, as you gather more champions, that should hopefully open up, right? So at this point, though, if you've been following along and you've been pushing, you know, your missions, you've been following on your missions, you've been progressing your campaign, you've been developing your champions to a point where you have at least a strong core team, you should be pretty much maintaining a pace that keeps you towards your first focus, which is Arbiter. I feel like Arbiter is like a really, really good indicator of when the game opens up and you actually have like what you need to make an impact in this game. A lot of that's going to be, you know, champion pool dependent and all that stuff like that. But that's a good indicator that you're on pace. Like if you're maintaining that as your focus, everything that's on the way and you're working your way towards that along the way will hopefully bolster your account up to a point where you'll see that fruition, right? At that point, maybe, and just maybe, you may be able to try looking into Hydra. I think that it's possible to do some attempts at it at maybe normal, but difficulty will arise depending on your champion pool and efficiency and gear. And that will impact your capability in terms of like being able to perform well in Hydra, right? But nevertheless, it's something you need to be aware of, right? And that's a whole nother row of mechanics that you're going to want to look to diverse yourself in. And there's certain champions that stand out, and there's some champions that don't. So like, it's very, very important to identify where they're valuable at. And there's resources online, and I'll go ahead and give it a nod to it. Like Hell Hades, for example, has a breakdown on each champion that's very, very good. And ways that you can utilize that champion to hopefully do it. And of course, other content creators like myself, you know, we'll always give you feedback about ways that we use our champions and how they would help. So feel free to ask questions, you know. At that point, though, I would say that like as you're playing the game and you're developing more and more ways to progress your account, you'll be exposed to other areas like Arena, right? Arena 3v3 becomes a little bit more valuable now. It becomes open to you. So like this is a great place for you to start farming. You'll probably stay in bronze because getting to the upper bronze and / silver and higher starts requiring you to actually be like, you have to make an effort towards it, right? It's not going to just be an absolute gimme. So not only that too, you need to have a minimum of 3x5, so 15 champions, right? To be able to do that. And if champion pool is very small, well, you can't really expect to be able to, you know, fill up teams, right? So it's going to take some time to build up those slots and then get champions for them and then build them up for that particular fight. And, you know, there's the, you know, compositions that have to have synergy in order to make them work, right? At that point, though, I would say you're looking at mid-game, though. Once you start hitting that point where you're looking at, like, 3v3s, you're looking at Hydra, you're looking at all these different areas of the game, you finally hit that point, you know, right? Like, you're there. I would say another good reference point that you're looking at potentially being able to finish Nightmare campaign. So you're looking like, all right, maybe I got a Paragon along the way or an additional champion that can hard carry me through Nightmare content, you know, to your duo team to kind of push through to get the shards you're looking for, or any of the campaign completion, you know, resources you can have. That would be something that you would be looking to, like, acquire at this point, right? Also, another benchmark to say reference point that you've hit mid-game would be like your acquisition of Arbiter herself. So if you just got Arbiter, that would mean that, like, all right, I've made some strides in my account. I have been going the distance, so you're looking to maybe have dungeons at 20 start to become a little bit more farmable, and you start developing diverse teams. Content progression is looking a little bit more, a little bit more optimal. You're starting to see your champion pool bloom, right? So that seed that you were planting, that little hustling that you were doing early game will start to bloom, and you'll start seeing now, instead of having one core team to do everything for you, now you're starting to have, this champion and this team and this champion and this team. And you're like, now instead of having one team, you have teams, plural, right? And that's a huge indicator that you're now like at the point where you're progressing in your account, right? I would say at this point, you're also looking to maybe dabble in Sand Devils. Sand Devils is a little bit harder of a contest. Same thing with Iron Twins Fortress. If you are looking to progress those and your champion pool as well as your gear has been on pace and you're doing very, very well, maybe you can look at stages like stage 7 for Sand Devil, maybe 5 to 10 at most at IT. But once you start getting into the higher content, it starts to get a lot more difficult because the stat requirements are demanding, right? For Clan Boss, you're looking to roughly now sit at Brutal to Nightmare territory, maybe even edging forward to like beating Ultra Nightmare, or pushing Ultra Nightmare as a given, right? If you got into a point where you're acquiring Arbiter, then you should roughly be in Arena Gold, 3 to 5. If you can farm happily between 4 and 5, then that's ideal. Like you maybe not be pushing Platinum Arena just yet, but you are looking to like develop your Great Hall ever more. And I think in order for you to acquire Arbiter, you have to have at least one of your Great Halls fully developed to level 10. One of your bonuses fully maxed out. So at that point, that means you have to be able to farm, gold medals and below, right? So that means that you're roughly in that range, right? You're at least holding strong in that range. So at that point, because of how your count is progressing, you're looking at normal Dune Tower to become a little bit more completable. Secret runes, mostly achievable. This may be contingent upon maybe you're lacking in those secret runes that require you to have like an excessive amount of like barbarian factions, for example, and you don't have a lot of those going on right now. That would be like the caveat behind this, but for the most part, being able to progress and achieve most of the normal secret rooms becomes a little bit more feasible as you're going along, right? I would say that hard Dune Tower progression, you may be able to start dabbling in like the first couple of floors, but there's going to be roadblocks, right? You're going to be hit with that wall that says that you got maybe you have the champions, you don't have the gear, or maybe you have the gear but you don't have the champions. So that roadblock is going to be ever present. It's going to stop you and be like, all right, you need to go farm up a little bit more to go to the next step, right? I think at like this point at gear, you're looking at a minimum of like 5-star gear or higher. You'll try to aim for stats over sets. But at this point, now you're starting to look at, all right, I want really good stats inside really good sets, So like you're going to start now taking that Wild Wild West approach of just looking for the best stats everywhere, and now you're trying to pinpoint, okay, I want to bring it even further, even more locked in, Like I'm looking for damage stats within damage sets, or I'm looking for utility stats or support stats inside support sets, like your Immortal, your regeneration, or whatever the case may be, like support stats inside those, and so on and so forth. So you kind of have that delineation now, If you're looking to run Savage, then you're looking to be able to put big damage dealing stats inside that Savage piece and make it work for you, right? Now, I would say that Hydra Normal and potentially Hard should become a lot more achievable because your champion pool has expanded, right? The more depth you have to your champion pool, the more easier it is for you to quantify maybe pushing Hard and maybe even looking at Brutal. But like for the most part, normal should be achievable at this point. Hard would say you're there. You're roughly maybe a couple of tinkering away from like gear standpoints or composition approaches, or maybe you're that one champion off. But even then, you're able to make a dent into Hard Hydra, right? For Silver, I would say at this point you're looking to maybe push your palette up even more in terms of being able to maintain into early Silver. This may be a little bit contingent upon what you've been focusing on, and as always, you always want to refer to like your missions or your raid projects roadmap that you've developed. Like what, Arena was not so much of a focus, but is a focus now. So you should see like those efforts start paying off as you're pushing more into that focus, right? So like being able to get into Silver and maintaining it should be feasible. And I would even say that, like, depending on how much you've progressed in the game, you should have potential to push into maybe gold for 3v3, right? Late game is where things really get interesting. So, this was one that I went back and forth with the people I referred to when I was first progressing. But it does make a little bit of sense, Late game is kind of like the indicator that you got what you need to do things, but now your investment into them is what's going to pay off, right? So faction wars, all the other stuff. Lydia at this point becomes acquirable. This is when you're first now getting into the point where late game is opening up for you, right? Farming on dungeons at stage 25 should be easy at this point. You're able to speed farmer and maybe even have solo compositions, which I don't know if there's enough interest in it just yet, but I did do a very minimalistic Theodore approach, and I use certain things that his kit does that benefits him, and then I also took that in mind when I was building that solo comp build for him. So I'll maybe showcase that in the future, but like for the general purposes of this video, the rate progression, you know, when you say in your late game, that should be a no-brainer. You know, being able to farm 25 dungeons at a minimum now in terms of like ease of difficulty, like I'm a click away from finishing it, you know what I mean? Instead of, you know, your thinking is, I can try to beat this, but I don't think I will. No, it should be, I can beat this. This is freelo, right? Progression into hard mode dungeons now should be somewhat efficient either, depending on where you're at. So you may be able to clear it consistently, and then clearing it fast. So that's the jumping points, right? So like clearing it for the first time means that you're at the gear point where now you can actually approach that content. Being able to farm it, which is consistent farm, is, you know, your gear is there to a point where you're able to carry your stuff in that dungeon and you know, farm it for resources. Speed farming it is the next step afterwards, which late game, depending on where you're at in the game, you may be able to do a little bit depending on where you're at. But at the very least, you want to be able to clear it, you know, consistently. Up to stage 10 should be possible. Besides Fire Knight would be the exception here. I would assume, though, based on what my experiences have been, and I can tell you this from my own experience, farming Spider and Dragon on hard is actually not that hard as you develop your champions and whatnot. In particular, the difference between like Spider normal and hard is that like with Spider normal, you benefited a lot from keeping the Spiderlings alive, whereas in hard mode, it's all about nuke them, you know, and if your champions are built up well enough and your team's devised well enough, and there are some stat requirements, right? You know, the speed, like it's a jumping point, you know, being around mid game when you're before doing hard mode content, being in the 200s, early 200s for speeds, for example, is pretty much the norm. When you get to like harder content, being able to sit comfortably at like the 240, 250 range becomes a little bit more of the expectation, right? So those little jumping points will become an indicator on whether or not you're ready for that content. But for the most part, being able to get to it, maybe even farm it, becomes a little bit more of an approachable task, right? These three stages right here should be fairly easy for you to dabble in and complete. Particularly these two are the ones I focus a lot of because, you know, I'm always farming for speed gear, or I could use a couple more accessory upgrades to the 9 yards, right? Mythic gear becomes a little bit more accessible, right? Fire Knight being the exception. Ice Golem is not as desirable for me at my account, but like I said, it's a niche set, so at this point, because your champion pool is diverse, maybe you are looking to build up some niche compositions or niche champion builds because they serve a purpose, right? And being able to do that should be feasible for Ice Golem, right? Fire Knight, however, is a totally different monster, and it has specific champions to be effective with, as well as specific gear requirements that are substantially harder than the other dungeons. So it's like, don't even look at that unless you feel like you're ready to approach it, right? Harv Dune Tower now is a focus, and you should be able to complete it every month. Maybe not speed farm it, but at the very least, you're on your way. You know what I mean? Like, you should roughly maybe, and this is something I would say, like, for me, I consider myself more of a late game player. I'm able to beat, and as of this recording, we're in the rotation for the third rotation, which is Dark Fae. I have been able to successfully not only complete hard across all the other different rotations, but I'm even farming the top final boss. So there's a video I did on Dark Fae and how to farm it with turn meter manipulation and, you know, all that 9 yards. So you got to see it in action, right? But for the most part, I'm able to clear all of my faction wars, like completion at the very least, completion of hard every month, right? So far that's checked off for me. Faction war stages, roughly at this point, you know, since you have Lydia, that means you've beaten every stage with nobody dying, which is the hard part. Now it's at a matter of like, all right, can I farm 20 and 21 effectively? So maybe developing your teams less so much for survival and maybe for just speed clearing is where your next direction is going to go at, right? Arena, you should be maintaining gold 5 at all times at this point. It should be, you sneeze and you're in gold 5, you know what I mean? It should not be a problem. This focus should be very, very acquirable. And I would even say that, like, pushing plat is maybe, depending on your focuses at that point in time, it's an eventuality or potentially a reality if you're looking to push more and more towards that area. You will get hit with some monsters and some roadblocks along the way, and that may be an indicator that you're not ready. But it is something that, like, you know what? something that was like inaccessible or impossible to reach has now become the next step. You know, that's maybe the next step for you if that's what you're looking at for arena push, right? Clan boss, Ultra Nightmare should be within 2 key range minimum now at this point. You should be able to effectively farm both Ultra Nightmare and Nightmare daily without too much of an issue. Hydra Brutal becomes a little bit more accessible, and below that should be 1 key capable. I say capable as a caveat because like most of the times when you're entering into late game, there's a little bit of like a reprieve period that I would say is like you need to kind of like reassess your account and be like, all right, well, since I'm now looking at hard content, I need to take my account to the next level, and you're slowly bolstering your teams back up or redevising them, reassessing them, the whole 9 yards, right? That's what I mean by reassessing your teams. And at that point, Brutal, the jump from Hydra Brutal to normal or to hard, from hard to Brutal, is a very, very, it's a chasm. It's a really, like, you could see that there's, like, you think that, like, normal to hard was, like, roughly about, like, that much in terms of, like, the jump. This is, like, a bigger indicator of, like, from hard to Brutal. It's a very big step. But it is within reach. It should be maybe even obtainable for you to do top chest, right? And depending on how focused your clan is and being able to develop that, that becomes more of a reality of you being able to farm that, right? 3v3, I would say at this point, you should have potential to be able to reach Gold 1, but you may have issues maintaining placement because you are going against people who are a lot more aware, a lot more aggressively approaching arena. So, like, if this hasn't been a focus, this will be a little bit harder for you to do. So, as always, this is just a reference point. Like, I have to give a disclaimer again. A reference point of where you should be at across the board for most content. I kind of dropped off certain areas like campaign. You're not really worried about campaign anymore at this point. Solo compositions will help you farm not only, you know, the gear or tournaments, but in tandem with that, maybe even doing some champion farming on the side. That's the whole point of like solo composition. You're double dipping into different forms of like progression, right? Gear as well as tournaments, as well as champions being farmed up for levels and all that, your food, you know, all that becomes a little bit more easier to do, right? Now, if you are farming in campaign, it'd be solely for the fact that you're just trying to get champion levels and maybe a little bit of silver on the side, right? Should be easy. You have one champion that can do it for you, and you're running through it pretty easily, right? But that's pretty much like a good indicator that you're in that late game period. If you're having some deficits in certain areas of this, but you're like almost there, you feel like it's reasonable to expect yourself to be there, then that's a good indicator that you're practically on par with what's considered late game, in my opinion. In game, now this is where it's gotten a little bit more nuanced for me, and I would say that like there's some parts that I was arguably agreeing with or disagreeing with. However, I did refer to other people who I felt like were there at that point in time of their game progression when I did read when I did go down this ideology of like what is considered what for the lack of better words. But in game, upon discussion, we were thinking like speed farming hard Doom Tower. So basically, you know, you have teams developed that will be a matter of just click and you can walk away and it'll do what it has to do. You don't have to worry about progression anymore at this point. It's just a matter of just doing it, right? Bosses, you may even have some specific teams or champions that are able to solo. So like, for example, Vergis maybe in a Destroy Immortal set or some kind of like set bonus that'll allow you to do what you need to do for the scared boss, right? Easy to farm. Solo, you know, he's doing what he has to do. Same thing for all the other different bosses in the fight or different waves. You have your Seer Clear team or your Poison Explosion team that's hyper farming those stages within seconds. You know, it's very, very easy. Speed farming, you know, that's the whole context of it, right? Hard dungeons. Hard dungeons are no longer a problem. In-game means that you have reached the peak of all content for the most part. So dungeons are no longer an issue. You probably should be able to speed farm them without too much of a duress. At this point, you're not really hurting for anything. All your champions that you need to be able to do any type of content has been acquired. I think that Platinum Arena is an easily attainable feature for you if you so choose to focus with it. I know a lot of people gave me some lip when I first started talking about this idea about a road progression video, that like just because I haven't hit platinum doesn't necessarily mean I'm not considered in-game. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm trying to say is that like even though you may not be at plat right now, if you wanted to, you can make strides that are significant towards maybe even hitting it consistently. And at that point, Plat Arena should become more of a capable aspect, right? You know, the meta champions that define top end arena are within your wheelhouse of pool, and the gear that you need to maybe counter them or to facilitate your team being able to do what they have to do. Your stone skin, your shield bolster sets, all those sets that are super supportive, or the nuker set, your lethal gear, you know, all those pieces are brought to their peak form so that you're able to slam and just do what you need to do, right? Plat Arena should be attainable. if you so choose to focus it, right? And then at this point, because everything is on farm, everything has been completed, great hulls are completed, there's no, you want for nothing under the sun. Ramontu should have been acquired, right? You should be able to easily obtain him. And I would say that depending on your focus, like it's a matter of focus at this point for in-game players, is whether they want to or not, right? This should be a fairly easy to acquire champion, right? A lot of this may be gated by like time and like, certain rotations of like potion keys being available or farming specific type of things that are contingent upon like, I just need this to come around so I can do it, right? May slow this down, but for the most part, being able to acquire Ramontu is just a thought away, right? As always, at the same point of like where we were at for late game, being able to at least at a minimum 2-key Ultra Nightmare and 1-key Nightmare was a reality. Well, at this point, if you so happen to really put your efforts towards it, 1-key Ultra Nightmare and Nightmare daily is literally a thought away. You can do it. You will do it. You are doing it. You know what I mean? And then also with Hydra, you are capable of being able to 1-key that difficulty and below. Of course, you may have to, flip up some gear, depending on the nuance of like your team composition. You have to work around with what you have, right? But for the most part, everything is obtainable. Your champion pool is diverse enough to a point where you have a bunch of different teams for Hydra, and they're all capable of clearing, the various different difficulties that are available to us. And then, of course, 3v3. Because you're able to push into Plat Arena from a classic standpoint, you should have no issues being able to do what you have to do in 3v3, right? Your team pool, your champion pool is diverse, your gear pool is diverse and bolstered up to a point where you're able to slam into that concept without too much of a concern, right? Maintaining that gold 3v3 era placement, it should be fairly easy at this point. Now, I didn't talk throughout most of this this progression, and if you guys have been listening along so far, I definitely appreciate you hanging in there with me. I know this is a little bit more of a nuanced video, but I didn't talk about Live Arena as well as other certain areas, and I'll talk about that now. So, like, Live Arena is kind of new, and at this point in time, it's pretty whale heavy on the top end side. I mean, I'll go and give you guys an example. I consider myself a late game player, right? I think there are certain areas where I could probably do some improvement. I just haven't focused in that in terms of like, check marking off of that list that I showed you guys earlier from the notepad. But Live Arena, since that's the focus of the conversation here, I'm not that progressed. Like Arena, I feel like I've done enough to get me by, but even then, I feel like there's so much more room for improvement for my account. As if I were to develop and focus on Live Arena champions, develop my PvP teams to their peak, I could do so much better. Even with that being said, and this is gonna be laughable for a second here, but I lose just as much as I win. And to give you context, to show you the leaderboards, I have a 51% win rate. I've done roughly around like 500 battles. I missed a couple days. I'm not refreshing as as actively as maybe some more of the higher end teams, some people from the Madhouse and whatever the case may be. But I am able to make progression right now with the way that they changed the system for your arena point rating, going up and down depending on your win-loss. Has been practically halved to a point where no matter what, as long as you're winning decently enough, like if you win just a couple points, like if you have at least above a 50% win rate, you will continuously climb. Gold will become of an eventuality. It's not a potentiality, it's a reality. It's coming, it's on the way. It's an in process standpoint. Now, the more effective you are at farming, the quicker it gets. But I will say that throughout your account, this opens up at level 50. Most players at level 50 will probably not be ready for this type of content. My account is level 89 as of right now, and it is not ready for Live Arena. I get myself, like, when I'll show you, for example, there was a battle I had against this team right here. I tried my best. I'm using my Razavark, who's not ideal for Arena. I'm using a poorly geared Duchess, Ragash, and a not-so-fast Arbiter. And I thought I was doing weird because I killed maybe the Rondo or the Lydia. And then this guy, Taurus, one of the meta champions in the game, from this guy, this MLPP guy, he one-shot my team. Like, I had buffs. I had everything. I thought I was doing okay. I was like, you know what? Maybe I can win this. And that man said no in one shot. And that just like, all right, that guy I'm not ready for yet. And that was like a, You know, like it's a good indicator to kind of show you like, yo, this is what you have to accept going into live arena. And sometimes some people don't like it. I know that it can get a little drawn out waiting for picks and bans, waiting for people to make their turns. A lot of impatience is something I hear a lot of players have, and to be honest with you, I understand it. Like, I'm ready to make my move. Like, if I feel like everybody's down, you know, in this team and they only have Cardiel, for example, left, and it's just a matter of killing him because my whole team is alive, it's a battle sustain at this point, and I win that battle, right? So why wait? You know, go ahead and surrender so I can move on to the next fight. I only have 2 hours to fight within a window, right? Or maybe I started late and I only have 30 minutes left and I'm trying to hustle and get my runs in, right? I think that like that's an understandable frustration, but at the end of the day, this is a live arena, so you're playing with other people. I know some people did say before in the past that like at a minimum you should do this actively. You get your 3 losses, the 4th round should be a bot, or I think it's 2 losses or 3 losses, something like that, where, you know, after consecutive losses you get at least 1 bot that you would fight, and it should potentially be easy for you, right? So even if that we were to take that in mind, you should still progress in that, because eventually you make slow strides. People who are progressing throughout the entire time, people who are probably watching this video right now, like if you're watching, you may be like, you know what, I'm trying to figure out how to progress and make my account a little bit more effective, right? And to be honest with you, this is an underrated utility, right? This live arena hasn't been out for very, very long, and I'm already making strides within, you know, the first couple months where I have like a couple blues. You know, I'm basically at the point where I'm 1 level up away from now needing to be in gold to be able to take my to take the resources I have up. And I'll be honest with you guys, this looks like it's all over the place, but there's a method behind the madness, and I'll at least explain that, like, depending on what you're trying to farm, if you're trying to get into hard content and your gear may not be up to par, a crutch or maybe another way to approach facilitating getting you your needs is definitely within area bonuses. For example, speed requirements at 250 for my damage dealers is a lot harder to acquire in terms of speed. So if I slack off on maybe 10 points, and that would break my composition from working, well, being able to facilitate those 10 points within a level 5 or, you know, area bonus for your Great Hall for Spider's Den would be the trick, for example, right? So no matter what, this is just extra benefits that you can get to hyper farm areas in the game that you may be progressing in, or speed clearing. You know, who doesn't mind the extra free stats, right? That's the way I look at it. This is a blessing more than it is a curse or a detriment for your account. The more quicker you're on this, the faster you're going to see improvements in your progression. And I think that's the main thing I'm trying to push out here is like getting your teams, getting your Great Hall developed to a point where if you have 80 stats here from for Fire Knights, for example, I'll even make it simpler for you. If one of the first dungeons you focus on is dragons, right? 80 stats there plus another 80 from your affinity bonus, that's 160. At stage 25, if we do the metric of 10 times the stage level, that's 250, right? Roughly in terms of points you need. If you add 80 plus 80, then that's 160. Take that difference from 250 to 160. That difference is probably a lot easier. That number that you're going to get there is a lot easier than it is to try just facilitating doing a full 250. Keep that in mind whenever you're building up your champions and you know, developing your teams and whatnot, because this is a blessing more than it is a curse. That's basically the long and short of it, right? Now, with that being said, selling your soul for meta champions will vary on quality of soul. No, I'm just playing. The main thing that I want to kind of tell you is yes, there's going to be certain areas, like live arena is a really big indicator about like how much you spend in the game, or like your ability to acquire meta champions, and sometimes it is unfair. That is the reality of it, and hopefully player is aware and they're making strides to not only counter that experience so that the overall player experience is higher, but the main focus I would say is that like this game doesn't really do a great job of telling you how to progress in this game or what to do. It's a very sandboxy experience in the sense of like you can go right now and focus on this particular dungeon, and whether that's the play or not is going to be up for debate at all times of the game, right? So for example, like maybe some people who are watching this thinks that, yo, this champion right here that just recently is acquiesceable is a solid champion, and then there are other people gonna be like, no, this guy's booty, you know? I'll give you a perfect example. Razovar for me was game changing. He went from taking my team from a 2-key territory to a 1-key territory consistently. That partnered with some other champions, right? Other people who have been playing who are at a different point in the game are going to say, this guy's not worth it at all. Why are you picking him up? And I would say that like your experience is going to vary, and that's the thing that makes this game so grand, is that like you're always going to have a different experience to your counterpart. Don't get lost in the FOMO of things. Don't get lost in the fear of missing out. Don't get lost in the comparison. Comparison is the destroyer of happiness. And I think that what you should look at this roadmap progression video that I'm doing right now is like a reference at the very least a reference point, not the law. You know what I mean? I think that there's always going to be content that's going to come out that's going to push maybe, you know, some of this content down to maybe the late game. But I thought it would be a great way to explain how this video shows you of some key points to like look for whenever you're locking into saying that you're at this point in the game or not, you know. And if you feel like, well, I got one or two of these things checked off, but this one I'm struggling a little bit, that may be a good indicator to, as a reference point for you to like, you know what, maybe that's what I need to farm towards next. That's an idea of something I need to make an effort towards. Maybe add that towards my to-do list on project boards, you know. And I think that would be the biggest value that I hope that gives to you guys at the end of it all. As always, if you like this video or if you enjoyed the content or if you feel like this thing spoke to you in a way that resonated, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you disagree with it, I would be open to the conversation. I think at the end of the day, we will have different opinions depending on where you're at in the game, and that's perfectly fine. It's to drive conversation at the end of the day. But feel free to let me know. You know, this platform right now, the way I have it devised and the way that my channel is set up is I want to engage you guys. So please let me know what you think. Feel free to follow me on Twitch if you want to see us get down with some of the action live. Twitch.tv/SoulSaint. As always, we're always getting into some randomness and shenanigans and whatnot. So feel free to enjoy us there. And as always, guys, always remember, stay ascended.
So it's 100 on the